Images of planet Earth seen from the International Space Station are fascinating. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to create in Blender a cinematic simulation of one of those day-to-night transitions captured by the ISS. We're going to create the geometry and materials for the sky with procedural star field, Earth, clouds, and volumetric atmosphere, and also dynamic day-to-night texture maps transition. We will animate the rotation of the Earth as well as the camera orbiting around the planet. All assets used in this project are free, and you can find the download links in the description below. In less than 30 minutes, you'll be already able to create an awesome sunrise on Earth seen from space such as this one. Are you ready? Let's get started! The texture maps we are using in this project come from the NASA website, visualearth.nasa.gov, and the collection is called Blue Marble. They are completely free and super high quality. Choose the resolution that fits better with your computer and graphic card capabilities. The International Space Station 3D model comes from the Sketchfab website. There are several models available, and some of them look pretty nice. In the description, you will find the link for the one I chose. The format of the file is GLB. You can open it in Blender under the option Import GLB. Earth is a sphere, so it makes sense if we start by adding a UV sphere, right? There's better ways around this. As you can see, the topology of the UV sphere has some triangles toward the poles, and that can be a problem later if we want to use a subdivision surface modifier. So let's see how to create a sphere with a cleaner topology. Very easy and fast. Let's get rid of this one, go to Add, Cube, and now in Edit mode we subdivide by 15 times. Click on Mesh, Transform to Sphere. Also clicking Shift-Alt-S, and now dragging the mouse all the way to the right. As you can see, we have a sphere with a much cleaner topology, entirely made of quads. With our sphere ready, let's rename it to Surface. Let's go to the modifier properties and add a soft surf modifier. Change the dimensions to 5 meters. Apply the scale. Let's also shade smooth. And now we duplicate this object, Shift D, and rename it to Clouds. The clouds are above the surface, so we need to make this slightly bigger. Let's go to 5.04. Apply scale and Shift D again for a new duplicate. This time we want our atmosphere. Again, this layer needs to be bigger, so let's set the dimensions to 5.2. Apply the scale. And now we're gonna parent all three to an axis so that when we rotate this axis, the surface, the clouds, and the atmosphere rotate at the same time. So add empty plane axis. Let's rename this to axis Earth, and parent surface, clouds, and atmosphere to this axis. Parent object. And now if we rotate the axis, we see how everything is going along. As an extra detail, the axial tilt of Earth is 23.4 degrees in relation to a line connecting the North and South poles. So let's do this to add a little bit of realism. 23.4 degrees, and as you can see, now the axis is tilt, and we are ready to go set up our sun. Add light sun. Let's move it to one side. Create another axis, this time for the sun, same way as before, empty, plain axis. Rename it to axis sun. And in the sun light, let's go to object constraint properties and add a constraint track to, and in the target, axis sun. Now the sun is pointing to the Earth, and if we need to parent the sun and the sun axis, object, parent, object. Now if we rotate the axis, we see that the sun is orbiting around the Earth and the direction of the light always points to the planet. Of course, in real life, the sun doesn't orbit around the Earth. It's the Earth rotation on its own axis what creates the sunrise and sunset. But from the Earth point of view, it's the sun who is orbiting. Depending on where we plan to place our camera, we can animate one axis or the other. It's an easy way of keeping all options opened. Here is the material for our surface. We have image texture nodes where we upload the texture maps that we downloaded before from the NASA website. Plug them through a texture coordinate and mapping nodes. You can use the Wrangler add-on enabled and press Ctrl T on an image texture node and it will automatically bring these nodes. We plug generated into vector and from vector to all the rest of nodes. And we have the diffuse to the base color, the specular to the specular, the bathymetry to the roughness. This will add some details to the oceans. Don't forget to set all those to non-color. And finally the height through a bump node into the normal. We are not using displacement in this setup because we are using the eevee render engine and not cycles. And then if we move to the top, we see the second part of this material is a mask that is going to control whether our day or night texture is being shown. We upload our night lights, our city lights into this image texture node, set to sphere as well, go to an emission shader and plug into the first slot of our mix shader. And the mask is very easy to do in eevee. We just need a diffuse BSDF, a shader to RGB node which is non-existing in cycles, but we take advantage working in eevee and use it, pass it through a color ramp to control the transition between darkness and light if we want to be sharper or more faded, and plug this as a factor and both to the surface. Let's see how this looks. It looks pretty cool. Let's see if it's working. Let's go to the axis Earth and rotate the Earth, and as you can see the mask is working and we have dynamic day to night lights. And if we rotate the sun instead of rotating the Earth, we have the same effect working, and that's why we created two axes because it depends on the type of scene or of animation we want to create. We will use one or the other. So it's useful to have both configured. As you can see, we can see how the specular and roughness maps work. The land is flat while the ocean is more reflective and have some details which add richness to our surface. Now we're ready to go set up the material for our clouds. If you're enjoying this tutorial, please take 1 second to subscribe to my channel. That will help me a lot. Thank you. Rename it to clouds, and you will see how simple is this. Add image texture, Ctrl T, plug color in base color, generate it to vector, change flat to sphere, and open our clouds textures that we downloaded from the NASA website. It can take a little bit because it's a 21K texture, and now we need to make it transparent, and for that we connect color to alpha, and down here on the shading tab, settings, blend mode, we change to alpha hashed, and as you can see, our surface is visible now under the clouds, which is what we wanted. Here you can see the seam line of the clouds texture, and that's something you need to remember before setting up your final render. When you know where your light, where your sun is gonna be, then you just go to your cloud texture and rotate so that the seam line is in the night part. Then it's completely hidden and we just cannot see it. We can add a color ramp here. Add search color ramp, so we have a little bit more control on the, you see, feather of the clouds, if we want them more or less intense. But basically our clouds object is finished. Here it's our atmosphere material. As you can see, the setup is not too complicated and it's all based in a volume scatter. I learned this setup from Samuel Krug. He's got a very good tutorial, more than 1 hour, on setting up planet Earth in cycles, and it's true that the tutorial is a bit complicated to follow sometimes, but I feel very grateful because I learned a lot with it. I leave you the link in the description. So we are using his same setup. You can copy it and experiment with the sliders to see how they affect the overall look of your atmosphere. So we have the atmosphere applied, and as you can see, it looks pretty cool, but we need to get rid of this steppiness. For this, we go to render properties, and in volumetrics we see how all the parameters are set by default. We need to tweak those to get better results. So let's see how this looks from our camera view, and let's consider the real size of our object, which in this case is 5 meters, the diameter of our Earth, and by default the end of the volumetrics domain to say is set to 100 meters. That means that it's a total overkill. We don't need that distance, and we can get away with something much smaller, let's say 12 meters. That is already saved us a lot of processing power, hence render times. Then we have tile size. Let's go from 8 to 2. That will increase the render times, but will bring us a better quality. And samples, if we double to 1 to 8, we get rid of the steppiness almost entirely, but if we want to get it perfect, we can go to 256 and make a render test to see how this looks. So let's go to an empty slot, press F12, and let's see how long it takes. There we go. Now we're gonna create a sky full of stars. We can achieve this through different methods, for example, using a particle system, but those are normally expensive, and we can do it procedurally in a very easy and flexible way. Let's go to the Shading tab, click on Wall Properties and add new material. Name it to Starfield. Set the color to pure black, and here let's switch to World, and there we have the nodes for our world material. We're gonna add a Voronoi texture and plug it into the color. Here we see like black dots on a white background. If we increase the scale, we get a lot of them, and smaller and smaller. So if we can invert this pattern and make it white dots on black background, then we will start getting closer to having stars. So let's add a color ramp, plug it in between, and swap these two sliders. And now if we push the black closer to the white, we see how the number and the size of the stars decrease. So playing with these values and the scale, we can set how many stars and how big we want them to be. In my case, it's gonna be 105 for the scale and 0.045 for the black tab. Now, instead of plugging it to the color, let's change it to strength, and then we can give a tint to the color of the stars. Instead of being all white, we can give just a hint of blue, and we're good to go. Now if we get closer or further with our camera, the size of the stars doesn't change, and that's great because they are years lights away from us, so they work as they should. If you want to make a more complex star field, it's just a question of adding more layers of noise. Using Voronoi or noise texture, you can add stars with different sizes and levels of brightness and combine them all together. But for this project, I think just what we did it's good enough, because the power of our shot is gonna be on the earth and the sunrise. I've already added a camera, place it in a location where I like the framing, the crop of the earth that we're looking at, and same as we did with the planet, we parent the camera to an empty object, which is an axis, so that when we rotate this
object, this axis, the camera orbits around. So that way we have the Earth rotating on its own axis at the same time that the camera is orbiting around the Earth. That's why, I don't know if you can see in the screen so small, but you can feel in the stars that the camera is not stationary but actually is orbiting around the Earth. This is harder to explain with words than actually just showing to you. So here is what I mean. Notice Earth is rotating west to east, and at the same time the camera is orbiting also west to east around the Earth. Finally, there's a little animation of the camera itself panning in, getting closer. You can do this as you like, reframing, tilting, whatever, until you are happy with the result. Of course, you don't need to copy this at all. What you should do is experiment until you are happy and you find a combination of orbiting and rotation that it works for you. I'm happy with this now as it is, so let's go to our final step, which is composite and render settings. Before opening the compositing panel, don't forget to render one frame so we have something to work with. Make sure your bloom is clicked, as well as screen space reflections, volumetric lighting and volumetric shadows, because our atmosphere is a volume scatter material. Let's open the compositing tab, and there is our rendered frame. The setup I'm gonna use is super simple. I only want to add a very subtle touch to the render, so I'm only going to use two nodes. One is glare, the other one is lens distortion. Let's go add, search, glare, and well, here, as with everything else, you need to experiment and use the values that look better for you and for your project. For me, I'm using fog low, high, threshold very low as 0.7 and size to 9. So this is enhancing very slightly the glare, the bloom on the atmosphere as well as on the city lights. And the second node is lens distortion. We plug in between, and for the dispersion we just add 0.01. Now if you click N and zoom and move, looking at this at the corner, the stars on the edges of the frame, you see what this dispersion makes. It kind of separates the color channels and creates this simulation of chromatic aberration, which I find cool. So we are ready to render. First, we need to decide what format are we using for our output. I like PNG and EXR sequences rather than eevee or QuickTime, because this way, if Blender crashes you in the rendering process, you still keep safe the frames that were already rendered, and you can restart from that point instead of losing everything and needing to start from scratch. I'm gonna quickly go over the settings I used, but this depends a lot on your computer and your graphic card, so you just need to find the balance between the render times and the quality. I used 350 samples, bloom ticked, screen space reflections, volumetric lighting and volumetric shadows. The volumetrics I explained while we were creating the atmosphere material, but I'm gonna go over it because it's important. Finally, I use 0.1 for the start of the volumetric domain, 4 meters to the end, and that's because our camera is very close to the Earth, so we can get away with such a short distance and we save render times. Tile size to 2 and samples to 256. You can reduce that to 128 and the result will still be very good. Don't forget to save your project before rendering. It's a good habit that will prevent to make you lose your work when Blender crashes during the rendering. It is not so unusual. Press Ctrl F12 and go for coffee. When you come back, you should have something like this. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and found it helpful in some way. Please subscribe to my channel, help me continue uploading tutorials, and see you in the next episode. Thanks for watching.